My name is Annette Coy and my parents were James Jimmy Coy and Leonora Petiona. We were, if you like, somewhat born into the area in that Mum and Dad were able to purchase a house in Boundary Street after the war, which was a great achievement for them.
My name is Elva Keeley, formerly Lewis, and I was born at number 33 Buckhurst Street, Montague, on the 29th of November 1927. Our parents, Helen and Samuel Lewis, the last of 6 children, 4 sisters, 1 brother, and myself in that order.
My name's Kay Rowan. I've never lived in Montague, but I certainly live close to it and have always lived close to it in Pickle Street. But I've had a lot of relatives who lived in Montague.
My name is Ken Page. My father came from Ballarat and came down here as a young man, got married and rented a house in Thistlethwaite Street, South Melbourne. Montague.
I was born in Montague in 1933 and I'm 86 years old. My family were Jean Robertson and Thomas Furman. We lived in Montague most of our lives and we moved into Gladstone Street in 1937.
I'm Mary. Was Mary Whelan. I lived at 130 Montague Street, South Melbourne. I was born on the 11th of May 1937. I have 1 brother who died 10 years ago. He was John Joseph. I had an elder brother, but he died at birth.
Hi, my name is Emily Harriet Nixon and I was born in Montague in Gladstone Street, 175, and we had a family of 7 girls. Your turn.
Your name?
My name, Dorothy Violet.
Call out.
You were born in Gladstone Street? No,
No,
across the road.
I was
Station
born in
Street.
Port Melbourne, down somewhere where the railway used to run.
I'm Thelma Nixon, born in 175 Gladstone Street, and a family of 6 sisters I had to live with, which were beautiful.
Hi, my name's Steve Zakazidis. I was born in 1959 in South Melbourne, and the family home was in Coventry Street, South Melbourne. Where we lived was just 2 very short blocks away from Montague.
They bought an old car, an old tourer. I can't remember what it was, but fortunately we were able to go. We went to the snow, we went out picking mushrooms, that sort of thing. So I really had a lot better life than a lot of my friends.
I think Mum was a bit precious in a way. She was a bit of the Italian princess because she was the only girl and she had 4 brothers. And she was also a very attractive girl. But Dad's family, they didn't have much money. Mum's family had possibly a little bit more because her father worked and in as much as he had a job. It's not that my other grandfather didn't work. It was during the Depression, he was on the wharves and it was a bit different then. And if you were a bit of a smart mouth, like old Paddy was known to be, you know, you didn't always get picked up. They didn't like you, the bosses.
Went to kindergarten at the Lady Northcote Kindergarten in Buckhurst Street. Went to the Sunday school, St Barnabas Sunday School nearby, and started school at age 6. We started school late in those days. started school at Dorcas Street Stage School in grade 1, and some of the children coming to school in the middle of winter with no shoes and a light jumper or cardigan on, I thought they were tough until I grew up and learnt about the Great Depression, that they probably didn't have any shoes. But having a father who had a job right through that time, and Mum shopping at the South Melbourne market, Friday night at 9 o'clock, Mum would go back and fill the baby pram overflowing with food for my family.
I remember when Mum took me to Knott Street State School in Port Melbourne when I was 5 years old. I can still remember it. She took me there and left me there, and I got up at the window and watched her walking away and was crying and carrying on, something shocking. And so that was me first day at school. Different things I can remember. Miss Bailey, a teacher. Even as a kid, I think I fell in love with her.
There were lots of factories around because Montague was in the factory area, and so there was lots of opportunity for people to get work either on the railways, because the railway yards were quite large, not like the light rail is now, and of course the shipping down at the port and the shipping on the wharves, and there was Swallow and Ariel, the biscuit makers, biscuits and jams and ice creams, and there were all sorts of factories, Laconia blankets. 1914 they had, in Montague, they had the Dunlop factory opened up. So the area was very industrialised.
We worked at Laycock's, Laconia Woolen Mills.
Laconia used to do the weaving, you know, weaving.
Because the whole family, our great-grandmother was worked there, our uncles and aunties, they all worked there. And my grandmother was there, and she used to get the big bales of wool and throw them out. And I tell you, it was just, our uncle was funny. He'd get upset and he'd go out. I'm not coming back anymore. And then in 5 minutes he'd be back. And say, I'm not going to take any notice of them.
It's so fun.
My father, when the war started, he got a job at Dunlop's, and in 1942, I think it was, he came home from night shift, and Mum went to turn the light on over the bed, and he said to her, Jeannie, don't turn the light on because there's a plane out there and I'm not sure about it. So he got us up and we went out the front, and I remember standing there and seeing this plane fly over with big red sun on it, and that was the one that flew over the whole of Melbourne, and it flew over the top of Dunlop's and over the railway station and right over our house and went off towards the St Kilda area. Nobody was told about it. It wasn't on the news, and it wasn't... my father said to me, don't go and tell them at school tomorrow. And I said, why? And he said, well, I don't think you should. We heard guns later on, but they said the next day that it was target practice. But apparently they had been shooting at them from the rifle range down at Altona, yeah. And then it didn't come out until well after the war that that plane flew over.
The war was a very big part of their lives. And I said to him, why did you join the army? He said, he was with his mate, and he said, why not? He said, I didn't think I wanted to spend the rest of my life putting screws in valves. So Jim was very badly wounded there, and he was flown back to Australia, and then he was never really classified as being fully fit to return to battle. But one of the interesting things was he was fit enough to play in the Port Melbourne sub-district cricket side's last premiership, and that was during the war.
The beginning of the Second World War was 1939 and I was still at school. There were blackouts, you weren't allowed, windows were blacked out, and we had ID cards, and of course the Americans were here by this time, and they taught some of the girls to jitterbug, and not me, no, wasn't into that. A Sly Grog shop was an illegal place where they sold alcohol under the lap, so to speak. And mostly they were Americans, would turn up in a cab and buy their alcohol and go. And of course the police were always raiding them, but somebody always told them they were coming.
It was pretty hard in those days for children because you'd hear the adults talking about things if they came and invaded or whatever, and what they would do. Well, you're only young, you don't understand it all, but you get frightened because you hear all that talk.
The boys.
The
Yeah, they all joined up. Like when war was declared, they said, oh well, we better go.
Yeah.
So they were all popping off, weren't they? Like, going or joining up and...
And Wally?
Yeah.
Wally was
Our brother-in-law, he got killed in the war.
Yeah.
He's buried at Leigh, and he didn't even see the baby that was born, our little girl, and he was killed by the barges coming in, and a plane was coming over, and that's when they dropped it onto the barge. And he fell when it was hit. He fell on and saved another soldier's life. So that's what we can remember about that. Well, most of the Montague boys didn't come back.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Most of them. I can't tell you how many, and I can't forget the war years. And it's always in my mind. And as a child, I just can't forget it.
They lost 6 years of their lives in one respect. And I said to Mum about something. I said, they probably all had PTSD. She said, they probably did. She said, and I think of it sometimes. And she said, I remember, she said, your father had terrible nightmares, which I didn't know about until she told me. She had dreadful nightmares. She said, I woke up one night and he had his hands around my throat and she's sort of yelling at him. She said he had no idea where he was. But see, they were involved in all that hand-to-hand combat up in New Guinea too. And she said, we didn't. She said, we just got on with it.
My father was a hairdresser. They used to call him Sweeney Todd because he was that fast with a razor. I never ever saw him draw blood. As quick as he was always nervous of children because they would come along and throw a firecracker or something in while he was cutting somebody's hair. And one day he just decided to throw a bucket of water over them because he said he could have cut somebody's throat quite easily. I just loved living there because the people coming and going were so nice, even though they were, what would you call it, wharfies. They were nice families, not wealthy, didn't pay for haircuts often. He'd say, look, pay me when you've got it. It doesn't matter to me. And they'd knock at 10 o'clock at night, going to wedding the next morning and ask for a haircut. No, I've got no money, Jack. And he'd say, don't worry, what time's the wedding? Nappy Ollington was the first one that I know of that started, and I haven't read the story for a while, but when I was young, he was the one that started the two-up. And he was always, there was always two-up around, but it was hidden. You didn't know where it was. They didn't tell you. No one ever knew where it was. Different places. They'd play for money, yeah. But it wasn't bad as far as I was concerned. It was just a lot of fun getting away from the policemen. And my father used to say, watch the laneway from the bedroom, from your brother's bedroom, and tell me if there's if the police are coming down Alfred Street. So I used to say, Dad, they're coming. And they were coming down Alfred Street. Yeah, so they'd all whiz and tear up their tickets and run for their life.
When you'd go to school in the summer, you could go into Pop's shop and give him an orange and a penny, and he'd cut it in half and he'd put it in the ice tray and freeze it. And when you came home from school, you had a frozen orange. And that was special.
I must have been about 18. I was out walking and came across my nephew under the tree in a pram. The houses were so tiny and small, there was only one place to put a baby, who'd be about 6 weeks old, under the shade of the tree. The house was just too hot. And so I went and got my tiny little Bakelite camera, it was, and took a photo. It was the only tree in Buckhurst Street.
I remember in Buckhurst Street there was this woman called Mrs. Knight. And Mrs. Knight used to call me in to do odd jobs and that. She was an elderly lady. And so I'd do the job and she'd give me some money for doing the job. You know, 2 bob or something like that. And anyway, she said one day, she said, come in, Ken, and into the lounge and I'll play you a song. And I thought it was a piano that she had there, and I sat there and I listened to her play this piano, and I thought to myself, gee, she's very good. And she was playing it and playing this piano, and when it all finished and that, I gave her a little clap, and she looked ever so pleased. And then I left, and somebody told me later on it was a pianola. And
you know, the Montague Street Bridge is always in trouble with trucks. Well, it always used to look as if it was hanging down. And we used to ride about, because there was about 4 of us. And we used to ride bikes, right up to Normanby Road, and because Normanby Road had a dip coming down into Montague Street, and the bridge looked as if it was hanging down, we'd go one leg, hold on with one hand, and try and touch the road or the train line with the other hand and see who could reach it. When it was raining, the streets were very wide, very nice to play on and have good fun with. But we used to play boats, alleys. We used to play alleys. We used to get little boats and put matches in them and make them and sail them down the road, watch them go from one end of the block to the other.
I was very fortunate in having a brother older than me, because I got to some of the most amazing places around Port Melbourne and Fisherman's Bend. There was an abattoir where we used to sit on this. There was a pit, and the poor old pigs would be pulled over with their feet tied, and we would sit on the pit, on the edge of the pit, and watch them being slaughtered. Great fun. Yep. Just near the famous Montague Bridge, which people keep hitting, there are 2 very old houses on the corner of Montague Street and Gladstone Street. They were 2 new houses being built, and of course children played on building sites, as I did with my brother, and I'm playing along, and along came this fellow and said, come on love, I'll buy you some lollies. So my brother says, no you won't. Come on sis, we're going home. Put me on the scooter and took me home. Otherwise I wouldn't have been here to tell you this story without my brother.
The police then used to have a different way of handling recalcitrants, and they were more likely to with young kids as he said, give you a kick up the backside and say, I'm seeing your father in the pub, and you'd be more worried about what your father would do when he came home from the pub than you have anything to do with the police.
In those days, the pubs used to be shut at 6 o'clock, and he'd bring his 2 bottles home, and Mum would take them off him and hide them.
Oh.
And then he'd say to us, where did she hide them, darling? And we'd tell.
And then she used to send us out the back gate, go up the lane and wait for your father to come home.
Yeah.
You know?
In the pub.
Yeah.
And then they had a Just Men Club between so many of the men, about 11 of them, and it was on the corner of Boundary and Heath Street. They put money all in and bought it. And then they used to have their Sunday afternoons there, play billiards, have a drink. And they made arrangements that the last one living would get it, right? But I didn't think that was fair. But yeah, I don't know what happened and who got it at the finish, I don't know.
The Eclipse Theatre on the corner of Crockford Street, City Road and Pickle Street, that was great when that started. Everybody went to that theatre. That closed down in the early 60s. For a picture theatre, it didn't have a long life. It opened at the very end of the 20s, and that's not a long life for a picture theatre. But it was a very large theatre. It seated around about not quite 2,000, but and it was very modern.
At the back of the long yard there was stables because my grandfather had his horse and cart there, and that's where the floods used to come in. When it rained very heavy and the Yarra was backed up with the tide, the drains used to overflow into the lane, and sometimes it would flood so much the water had come right up to the back door. And there were lots of floods, and they're still there, and that's the reason why they can't change the bridge. The notorious bridge that shouldn't be notorious because it's not responsible, it's the drivers. My mother was coming home from work at Laconia, and there was a flood, and they were walking through the water. They had to take their shoes off, and they were walking through the water, and one of the guys went running ahead, and the next thing, he was dead. He ran across a live wire in the water.
I mean, when I grew up, there were houses all along Boundary Street, and we knew most people who lived in them. And then as they became empty, they started to be taken over or pulled down. There were houses, there used to be a little row of terraced houses just down from us, and they were the first to go that I remember, and then they built an office suite there.
In Thistlethwaite Street, we were the last house standing there between Montague and Ferris Street, and I remember what it was like with all the houses there before all the factories started springing up. It was a lonely place. And anyway, Hooker had been trying to get Dad to sell for a long time, and we started going up the Bucker Street because there was still a lot of kids and everything in the street there. Quite a few had gone, but there was still a lot there, and Thistlethwaite was just an empty place. And then they started moving from Bucker Street too.
61 when Mum and Dad moved out, and I don't know how long after the house was demolished, and I don't know what it turned into. They were pressured to move out. He wanted the house demolished, the guy that owned it, and they were pressured to move out. A lot of them were pressured to move out.
I always wondered, well, how many people live there? And it was a very small suburb, a very small suburb. But to me, I always say to people that Montague is interesting because a whole community of people, you know, families and workers and everything, and all the shopkeepers and things like that, it literally disappeared, and the suburb of Montague disappeared. And to my knowledge, it's the only suburb in Melbourne that has actually completely disappeared. I think Montague was first settled in the late 1850s. By 1900, there was 1,100 houses there. It had a lot of little streets and lanes, and there was something, in 1900 there were about 200 houses down little lanes and little streets, which is an extraordinary number. But in around 1900, my view is people who were quite wealthy, who owned a lot of property, you know, bought a lot of land down there. They built a lot of houses rapidly. Most of the houses, nearly all the houses, were pretty basic in structure. They probably used fairly low quality materials. And I believe that you know, the vast majority of residents who were living in Montague in 1900 were just renting the property. But in the late 1920s, interestingly, there was a fellow called Frederick Oswald Barnett. I think apparently he was called, they called him by the name of Oz. Somehow came across some very substandard housing areas around Melbourne, particularly in a lot of small streets. And Montague was full of that sort of thing, because when you look at the 1894 MMBW architectural drawings, which were drawn up to run sewers to Montague, the draftsmen they used drew in every house, every street, every laneway. They even drew in on the 1894 plans, you know, that if it had a veranda, if it had, you know, a backyard, if it had bricks or bluestone down and things like that. And of course all the little lanes and streets were also drawn in as well. Oz Barnett started to go around these substandard and, as he called them, slum pockets around Melbourne, and no doubt he would have spent a lot of time around Montague and South Melbourne, and he started to take photos of all these properties in the late 1920s, and then apparently he started to go around and campaign with the government to try and get the government to act around the, might have been the early 1930s or so. The government formed the Housing Investigation and Slum Abolition Board. In 1937, when this board issued their first report, at that point in time, they inspected 1,100 houses in Montague, and incredibly, only something like about 65 houses were fit for human habitation. What was it? It was about, there was about 450 odd houses were they were in need of extensive repair, but there was a little bit over 600 houses in Montague that were classified as slum.
So they killed Montague. They killed Montague for industry and greed. And they ruined a lot of people's dreams and a lot of people's homes, and it's a very sad thing.
It was a very unique area. It was only, I think it's only about 17 hectares, I think, Montague. It's a very, very small suburb, and it was a very, very small community, but it was packed with people, and obviously there were a lot of children there, and they had a fantastic community spirit. You know, people would help each other even though they had no money or anything.
We were a community because everybody helped everybody else. for instance, if there was a death in the street, everybody took up collection to buy a wreath. And everybody went to the house with something to eat for the people that went back to the house after the funeral. So it was more like a community than, like when I moved to Broadmeadows, I didn't know anybody. And when you'd go down Bay Street or up to the market, you'd add hours to your shopping time, because every few steps you moved, you met somebody you knew. And you could go to the shops at Broadmeadows and do your shopping and go home, and you hadn't seen anybody you knew, because people didn't. It wasn't a community, it was somewhere to live.
I would shift back there tomorrow if the people were there, because the people in those days, to me, cared a lot about people. Like if I went to a friend's place and it was dark, the men coming out of the hotel would call out to you, "Come on darling, don't you talk to any strangers. You go straight home." And they knew my dad, so they watched out for you. And everybody, they were all friendly. Whereas today, people are not. They can't even get away in a hurry. They don't want to help you. And I found that, to me, still is in here. And that comes from South Melbourne. You couldn't get a better place. And I'd go there tomorrow.
Our life, like the kids now, I don't know, we had nothing, but we enjoyed it. You know, it was, I don't know, we had so many friends that we knew that looked after us, and we helped one another. But see, these days, you don't, like where I live now, your next door neighbour don't even talk to you. So, you know, it's amazing. We had a great life. That's probably why we're still here.
Tell them when the girls get together, what do we sing? Oh. Come round any old time and make yourself at home. Place your feet on the mantel shelf. Go to the cupboard and help yourself. I don't care if your friends have left you all alone. Rich or poor, knock at the door and make yourself at home. That's Montague.
That's our song.
They're building factories now where our homes used to be, knocking down the houses, but not the memory. And though they have taken most of the homes apart, there is one thing they cannot take, and that is Montague's heart. Come on. They hold a back to Montague and all that can return. Critics have called it a slum place. Well, that may be their view, but they can't have their two-rack. We want dear old Montague.